In 1998, workers renovating a townhouse in London dug into the basement floor and found a human bone. Then another, then another. By the time the police arrived, they had uncovered over 1,200 pieces of human remains, including the bones of 6 children. This was not a cemetery. This was not a crime scene from a war. This was the basement of Benjamin Franklin's house. The same Benjamin Franklin whose face is on the $100 bill. The same Benjamin Franklin children are taught to admire. The question is not whose bones these were. The question is, what was Benjamin Franklin doing living on top of a mass grave? And why did he make sure no one ever found it? Forensic analysis reveals they belonged to at least 15 people, including 6 children. And they didn't just die there. They were sawn. They were drilled. They were dismantled. The Santa Claus of American history was living on top of a mass grave. Was the man who discovered electricity also a man who hid the darkest secrets of the Enlightenment? This is the story of the other Benjamin Franklin, the first American, who was also a member of the Hellfire Club, a lover of debauchery, and a silent partner in a house of horrors. To understand the bones, we must first peel away the myth of the good American. Benjamin Franklin was a man of masks. In his famous autobiography, he presents himself as a humble printer striving for moral perfection. He lists 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, chastity, and describes how he marked his progress in a little book. But the detective of history asks, why does a man need to write down a list of virtues? Because he possesses none of them naturally. Franklin wrote about chastity because he was a notorious womanizer who frequented the brothels of London and Paris. He wrote about temperance because he loved wine and rich food to the point of crippling gout. And he wrote about order because his life was a chaotic experiment of curiosity that often crossed the line into the grotesque. The house at 36 Craven Street is the physical manifestation of this duality. Upstairs, Franklin was the diplomat, but downstairs in the windowless basement, something else was happening. He wanted to know how the human machine was built. And in the 18th century, there was only one way to find out. You had to cut one open. The bones found in the pit were not victims of a murder in the traditional sense. They were victims of science. Forensic analysis showed scalpel marks consistent with dissection. The skulls had been trepanned. The long bones had been sawn through to study the marrow. We know that Franklin lived in the house with a young man named William Hewson. Hewson was an anatomist, a brilliant student of the famous William Hunter. In the mid-17th century, anatomy was a dirty, illegal business. There was no legal way to obtain bodies for study, other than the corpses of executed criminals. But science was moving faster than the law. To learn, doctors needed bodies, fresh bodies. This created the resurrectionists, grave robbers, who would dig up the freshly buried dead in the middle of the night and sell them to anatomy schools. The detective reconstructs the scene. It is 2 a.m. on a foggy London night. A cart pulls up to the back alley of 36 Craven Street. A heavy sack is dragged through the garden and down into the basement. Upstairs, Benjamin Franklin is perhaps writing a letter to his wife Deborah back in Philadelphia. He hears the thud of the body hitting the table. He smells the formaldehyde and the decay. Does he call the police? No, he is the patron. Franklin was not just a landlord, he was a mentor to Hewson. He encouraged these experiments. He sat in on them. The mad scientist in Franklin was fascinated by the biology of life and death. He protected Hewson. The garden at Craven Street was too small to bury the waste, and carrying disjointed limbs to the Thames River was too risky. So they buried the evidence right there, under the floorboards. For nearly 20 years, the Founding Fathers slept above a pile of mutilated children and paupers. the raw material of his intellectual curiosity. While living in England, Franklin was a frequent guest at the estate of Sir Francis Dashwood, the founder of the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wykeham, better known as the Hellfire Club. This was not a gentleman's club for tea and politics. It was a secret society dedicated to blasphemy and excess. The motto of the club, carved over the door, was Fais ce que tu voudras. Do what you will. This was a playground for the most powerful men in the British Empire to indulge their darkest fantasies without judgment. Why was Benjamin Franklin there? Historians say he was there as a spy or a diplomat. Franklin didn't just attend, he enjoyed it. He was a man who rejected the strict Puritanism of his Boston childhood. He was a deist who believed God created the universe and then walked away. The Hellfire Club was the ultimate expression of this belief. The tragedy of Franklin is best seen not in his vices, but in his virtues. Franklin had an illegitimate son, William Franklin. He helped William become the royal governor of New Jersey. They flew the famous kite together in the thunderstorm. But Franklin's love was conditional. When the American Revolution began to rumble, a chasm opened between them. Benjamin became a patriot. William remained a loyalist to the King of England. A normal father might respect his son's conviction, or at least try to protect him. Franklin did neither. He viewed William's loyalty to the crown not as a political difference, but as a personal betrayal. When William was arrested by the Patriots and thrown into a prison in Connecticut, Franklin did nothing to help him. Later, when William was exiled to London, losing everything, Franklin cut him out of his will. In his final testament, Franklin left William virtually nothing, adding a line that stings across the centuries. The part he acted against me in the late war, which is of public notoriety, will account for my leaving him no more of an estate he endeavored to deprive me of. This is the dark side of the genius. Franklin loved humanity in the abstract, but he was capable of icy cruelty to the humans actually close to him. He couldn't forgive his own son for holding a different opinion. We must also re-examine his most famous achievement, electricity. To us, the kite experiment is a charming story of scientific bravery. But to the people of the 18th century, Franklin was a wizard, a modern Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. His experiments were often cruel. He was obsessed with the power of the shock. He held electrical parties, where he would electrify the guests for fun. He devised a method to kill turkeys by electrocution, noting with a gourmand's delight that the meat was uncommonly tender. He once tried to treat a man's paralysis with massive electric shocks. He wrote about the guinea pig effect, using human subjects to test the limits of pain and endurance. There is a fine line between the scientist and the sadist. Franklin walked that line. In his Philadelphia laboratory and later in his London basement, he was tinkering with the fundamental forces of life. The bones in the cellar and the kite in the sky are connected. Both represent a man who refused to accept limits. He wanted to unlock the secrets of the sky and the secrets of the flesh, and he didn't care if he had to break a few laws or a few bones to do it. Franklin's life poses a terrifying philosophical question. Can a man be a great citizen and a bad man? He is the father of the self-help industry. His autobiography taught Americans that they could invent themselves. He taught us that appearance matters more than reality. It is not enough to be virtuous, he once said. One must also appear so. This is the key to the bones in the basement. Franklin knew that as long as he appeared to be the wise, benevolent sage upstairs, no one would question the smell of rotting flesh coming from downstairs. He understood that society judges results, not methods. He built libraries, fire stations, and post offices. He helped draft the Declaration of Independence. Because of these public goods, history has forgiven his private evils. We ignore the 1,200 bones. We ignore the illegitimate children. We ignore the hellfire orgies. We forgive him because he was useful to us. But the detective cannot forgive. The detective looks at the saw marks on the femur of a 6-year-old child found in Franklin's basement and asks, who was this child? Franklin didn't know and he didn't care. The child was just raw material for the advancement of knowledge. The year is 1770. The American Revolution is still a few years away. Upstairs, Franklin is hosting a tea party for British intellectuals. He is witty, charming, and quoting proverbs. Downstairs, William Hewson is dissecting a fresh cadaver, perhaps a pregnant woman dug up from a pauper's grave the night before. Franklin excuses himself from the tea party. He walks down the stairs, descending into the dark. The smell hits him, the metallic tang of blood, the earthy smell of the grave. He doesn't recoil. He smiles. He adjusts his spectacles and leans in to watch the knife cut through the skin. This is the Benjamin Franklin we were never taught about in school. This is the man who contained multitudes, a man of light who was inextricably bound to the dark. The first American was also the first great deceiver, and the bones are just the beginning. If walls could talk, the townhouse at 36 Craven Street would scream. From the street, it looked like the epitome of Georgian elegance, a respectable residence for a respectable diplomat. But inside it was a machine designed for duality. Imagine the sensory experience of living there in the 1760s. On the first floor, the air smelled of lavender water, beeswax, and expensive tea. This was Benjamin Franklin's domain, where he received earls and philosophers to discuss the rights of man. But if you opened the door to the basement, the smell changed instantly. It smelled of wet earth, sawed bone, and the sickly sweet stench of formalin and rotting flesh. Franklin didn't just tolerate this stench. He lived directly on top of it. For nearly 2 decades, he played the role of the benevolent grandfather of the Enlightenment, while literally sitting on a throne of bones. Benjamin Franklin was not the one digging up the bodies. He was too old, too fat, and too famous for that. He was the patron. The operator was William Hewson. Hewson was young, ambitious, and married to the landlady's daughter, Polly Stevenson. He was one of the finest anatomists of his generation, a man obsessed with the lymphatic system and the coagulation of blood. But in the 18th century, to be an anatomist was to be a criminal. The law only allowed for the dissection of executed murderers, a supply that nowhere near met the demand of medical science. Franklin saw in Hewson a kindred spirit, a man who believed that knowledge was worth breaking the law for. When Hewson established an anatomy school in the back garden of Craven Street in 1772, Franklin didn't object. In fact, he likely funded it. He became the silent partner in a body farm. The detective notes the power dynamic. Franklin was the father figure, the protector. His diplomatic immunity and high status provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect that the famous Dr. Franklin was running an illegal dissection lab? It was the perfect camouflage. Where did the 1,200 bones come from? They didn't walk in the front door. This introduces us to the darkest profession of Georgian London, the resurrection men. These were gangs of professional grave robbers. They watched the cemeteries. They knew when a funeral took place. Under the cover of darkness, they would dig up the fresh coffin, pry open the lid, and hoist the body out with a rope. The bodies were then stripped of their shrouds and carted to the anatomy schools. The bodies entering 36 Craven Street were likely dragged through the gloom of the Thames wharves, up the dark alleyways, and into the garden entrance. Franklin, an insomniac who often worked late into the night, would have heard the deliveries, the thud of the sack, the clinking of coins. He knew that the specimen on the table was, just hours ago, a grieving mother's child or a husband's wife. But the philosopher in him suppressed the human. To him, the corpse was no longer a person. It was a biological machine waiting to be reverse engineered. The excavation in 1998 revealed chilling details about what exactly Franklin and Hewson were doing. The children. A significant percentage of the bones belonged to children. Why? Because children's skeletons are softer, easier to cut, and reveal the development of bone growth. But it also implies a darker market. The bodies of children were harder to come by legally, suggesting they were stolen from pauper graves or orphanages. The thought of Franklin sipping tea while a child was being dismantled beneath his feet is a vivid visual of grotesque indifference. The trepanning. Many skulls had perfectly circular holes drilled into them. This is trepanning. They were likely testing theories on brain pressure or practicing surgical techniques. The sea turtles. Strangely, mixed in with the human bones were the bones of sea turtles. This is a classic Franklin detail. He loved turtle soup. But he was also curious. After eating the soup, he likely took the leftover bones down to the lab to study the anatomy of the reptile. It shows the blurring of lines, animals, humans, dinner, science. It was all just material to be consumed and studied. The saw marks. The bones were not just cut, they were sawed with precision tools. This wasn't butchery, it was surgery. But once the lesson was over, there was no respectful burial. The pieces were thrown into a pit in the dirt floor, discarded like trash. Franklin's life at Craven Street was not a bachelor pad. He lived with Margaret Stevenson, a widow who was his landlady. But historians agree she was much more than that. She was his London wife. For 15 years they lived as a married couple in everything but name. They shopped together, dined together, and hosted parties together. Franklin's actual wife, Deborah, was thousands of miles away in Philadelphia, afraid of crossing the ocean. This domestic setup at Craven Street adds a layer of psychological complexity. It was a cozy family environment. Margaret cooked the meals. Her daughter Polly was like a daughter to Franklin, and William Hewson was the son-in-law. It was a perverse family unit. The diplomat, the mistress, the daughter, and the grave robber, all living under one roof, bound together by affection and dark secrets. They protected each other. When the smell from the basement got too bad, they likely blamed it on the sewers or the Thames, smiling at their guests while standing over a charnel house. While Franklin was playing house in London and dissecting bodies with Hewson, his real life in America was crumbling. His wife, Deborah Reed, was loyal to a fault. She managed his businesses, fought off his political enemies, and even defended his house with a gun during the Stamp Act riots. But Franklin stayed away. He stayed away for 10 years at one stretch. As Deborah grew old and sick, she begged him to come home. She suffered from strokes. She lost her memory. She wrote him letters that are heartbreaking in their desperation. Franklin's replies were cold, chatty, and distant. He wrote about the weather, about politics, about his health. He made excuses. "I will come home next spring," he would say, and then spring would come and go. Why didn't he go back? Because Philadelphia was boring. Because Deborah was uneducated and couldn't discuss philosophy. Because in London, he was a celebrity. And perhaps because he was addicted to the freedom of his double life. Deborah died in 1774. Franklin was not there. He didn't even make it to the funeral. He received the news in London, perhaps sitting in the very room where he had ignored her letters. The fatal weakness here is narcissism. Franklin loved mankind, but he had very little use for individuals who bored him, even if he was married to them. He sacrificed his wife on the altar of his own convenience. How did Franklin justify the bone seller? He was a deist and a rationalist. He believed that the body was just a vessel. Once the spark was gone, the meat that remained was of no spiritual value. In a famous letter, he once compared the human body to the cover of an old book, its contents torn out, stripped of its lettering and gilding. He believed the book would appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, but the old cover was just trash. This philosophy allowed him to detach completely. He didn't see the desecration of the dead as a sin. He saw it as recycling. If digging up a corpse could teach a doctor how to cure a living patient, then it was a moral act. It is the ultimate utilitarian argument. The suffering of the few is justified by the benefit of the many. But the tragedy is that this cold logic erodes the soul. When you start treating people as mechanics, you stop treating them as humans. It explains how he could cut up children in London and ignore his dying wife in Philadelphia. To Franklin, they were all just broken machines. The anatomy school at Craven Street came to a tragic end in 1774, the same year Deborah died. William Hewson, in his zeal for knowledge, cut himself while dissecting a rotting cadaver. The wound became infected. Sepsis set in. The man who had dismantled so many bodies was now being dismantled by bacteria. He died in agony, leaving behind his wife Polly and 3 children. Franklin was devastated. He had lost his wife and his protege in the same year. The house at Craven Street, once full of life and science, was now filled with ghosts. He packed his bags. The American Revolution was brewing. It was time to go home and play the role of the patriot. He left the bones where they were. He didn't move them. He didn't bury them properly. He simply covered the pit with dirt, put the floorboards back, and walked away. For 200 years, the bones waited. They waited while Franklin signed the Declaration of Independence. They waited while he became the toast of Paris. They waited while his face was printed on the money. They are the silent testimony to the cost of the Enlightenment. We celebrate the advances in medicine, surgery, and anatomy that men like Hewson and Franklin pioneered. But we forget the price paid by the nameless poor, whose bodies were stolen to make those advances possible. Franklin's basement is a metaphor for America itself, a beautiful neoclassical structure built on a foundation of unacknowledged bones. If you travel about 30 miles west of London, you will find the ruins of Medmenham Abbey and the intricate cave system of West Wycombe. Above the entrance to the caves, carved into the chalk in ominous Gothic letters, is a phrase from Rabelais, "Fais ce que tu voudras," do what you will. This was the gateway to the 18th century's most notorious secret society, the Hellfire Club. Rumors swirled that inside these caves, the most powerful men in the British Empire engaged in black masses, worshipped Satan, and sacrificed animals. But the reality was perhaps even more disturbing. It wasn't Satan they worshipped, it was pleasure. It was a temple dedicated to the absolute rejection of morality. And walking among the monks, dressed in brown robes, holding a chalice of wine, was the grandfather of the American Republic, Benjamin Franklin. Why was the man who wrote "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise" spending his nights in a subterranean orgy? Sir Francis Dashwood was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He founded the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wycombe as a parody of religion. Dashwood hated the Catholic Church and the strictures of Christianity. He built the club to mock them. He decorated the gardens of his estate with statues of Priapus and shaped the foliage to resemble a naked woman. Franklin met Dashwood and was instantly charmed. They wrote the Dashwood Service together. It was a prayer book stripped of all references to the miraculous or the divine. It was deism in print. Dashwood invited Franklin to the inner circle. To the detective, this invitation is crucial. You didn't get into the Hellfire Club just by being famous. You got in by being one of the boys, willing to leave your conscience at the door. What actually happened inside the caves? The vivid visual is a scene of surreal decadence. The members, called monks, would arrive by boat down the Thames. They would don brown robes, but they were not alone. They brought with them nuns, high-class prostitutes or adventurous society ladies, who dressed in white habits. They would descend into the chalk tunnels, lit by flickering torches. The air was thick with smoke and incense. They would proceed to the chapter room. Here they performed mock religious services. They would sing obscene hymns set to church music. They would drink hellfire punch, a potent mix of brandy, wine, and fruit out of chalices. And then the service would dissolve into an orgy. The club was dedicated to Venus and Bacchus. It was a safe space for the elite to act out their sexual fantasies without fear of scandal. Franklin, the first American, was sure she was right there in the smoke. Did he partake? Historians often claim he was just an observer. But Franklin wrote fondly of the agreeable times at West Wycombe. He was a man with a ravenous appetite for women. It strains credibility to think that a man who famously advised, "In the dark, all cats are gray," would stand in the corner while the most exclusive party in England raged around him. Franklin's participation in the Hellfire Club explodes the myth of the Puritan founding father. In America, he preached thrift and temperance. In Poor Richard's Almanac, he wrote, "Maintain your rank, vulgarity despise." But in London, he was a glutton. He suffered from gout, a disease of kings caused by an excess of meat and alcohol. He was so fat he could barely walk. He wrote drinking songs. One of his most famous essays is The Drinker's Dictionary, listing over 200 euphemisms for being drunk. He wrote Advice to a Friend on Choosing a Mistress, where he famously recommended older women because they are so grateful. The Hellfire Franklin was the true Franklin. The Poor Richard Franklin was a character he played for the public. He fit in with the British aristocrats because he shared their cynical worldview. The rules are for the poor. The enlightened man is above the rules. This arrogance is the fatal weakness that blinded him to the coming revolution. He was partying with the very men who would soon order the destruction of American towns. One of Franklin's key associates in the club was John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich. Sandwich was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He was brilliant, corrupt, and notoriously immoral. Sandwich and Franklin were friends. They spent days together at Wycombe. The irony is staggering. During the American Revolution, Sandwich would be in charge of the British Navy, sending ships to blockade Boston and burn American ports. But in the 1760s, Franklin and Sandwich were monks together. They bonded over science and sex. But Sandwich was a dangerous friend. He famously betrayed his other friend, the radical politician John Wilkes, by reading Wilkes's obscene poem, Essay on Woman Allowed in Parliament, to ruin him. Sandwich earned the nickname Jemmy Twitcher. Franklin watched this betrayal up close. It taught him a lesson in British politics. Betrayal is a sport. Yet Franklin stayed close to Sandwich until the war made it impossible. He valued access to power more than the character of the men wielding it. How did Franklin reconcile the Hellfire Club with his conscience? The answer lies in his philosophy of deism. Deism posits that God created the universe like a watchmaker, creates a watch, wound it up, and then left. God does not intervene in daily life. He does not care if you drink wine or sleep with a prostitute. He only cares that the machine works. To Franklin, sin was not an offense against God. It was just a miscalculation. If drinking too much gave you a hangover, that was a mistake, not a sin. If sleeping around gave you syphilis, that was a medical problem, not a moral one. This worldview liberated him from guilt. It allowed him to sit in the caves of West Wycombe and mock the Bible without fear of lightning striking him down. But this philosophy also made him detached. It stripped the world of sanctity. Everything was permitted as long as it was rational and pleasurable. There is a detective theory that Franklin used the Hellfire Club for espionage. The club was the center of British political power. If you wanted to know what the king was thinking or what the Navy was planning, you didn't go to Parliament, you went to the orgies at West Wycombe. In the wine-soaked atmosphere, guards were down. Secrets were spilled. Franklin was the ultimate networker. He was the first American, not just because he was born there, but because he invented the American style of networking, mixing business with pleasure. He used his charm, his wit, and his tolerance for vice to ingratiate himself with the men who ruled the world. He was a spy in a monk's robe. But this came at a cost. By embedding himself so deeply in the corrupt British establishment, he alienated himself from the rising tide of Puritan anger back in America. While Franklin was toasting Bacchus, his countrymen in Boston were dumping tea into the harbor to protest the corruption Franklin was partying with. There is a famous legend about the Hellfire Club involving a baboon. John Wilkes, the radical agitator, decided to play a prank on the club. During a dark ritual, he released a baboon dressed in a devil costume into the cave. The baboon jumped on the back of Lord Sandwich. Sandwich, terrified, thought it was the actual devil coming to collect his soul. He fell to his knees and screamed, "Spare me, Lucifer. I am not as bad as I seem. I only persecuted Wilkes to please the king." The room erupted in laughter when the lights came up. Franklin would have witnessed scenes like this, the total humiliation of the ruling class. It fueled his cynicism. He saw that these lords were cowards and hypocrites. This knowledge empowered him when he eventually stood before them in Parliament to argue for American rights. He wasn't intimidated by them because he had seen them naked, drunk, and terrified of a monkey. As the political climate darkened in the 1770s, the Hellfire Club began to dissolve. The members grew old, Dashwood became ill, the public began to turn against the decadence of the aristocracy. Franklin, sensing the shift, quietly withdrew. He scrubbed the references to the club from his public image. He pivoted back to being Poor Richard. When he arrived in Paris in 1776 to seek French support for the revolution, he didn't wear the silk robes of a hellfire monk. He wore a fur cap and simple rustic clothes. He played the role of the Quaker philosopher. The French loved it. They thought he was a symbol of pure rustic American virtue. They had no idea that this rustic sage had spent the last decade in the most depraved sex dungeon in England. Franklin's genius was his adaptability. He was a chameleon. He could be a monk in Wycombe and a Quaker in Paris. But the detective knows the truth. The bones in the basement and the echoes in the cave prove that the sage was a sinner of the highest order. In the mythology of American history, there is a famous painting of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm. Beside him stands a strapping young man, his knuckles white as he holds the silk string, waiting for the spark of the gods. That young man is William Franklin. He was Benjamin's son, his confidant, his partner in science, and the joy of his life. In the history books today, William is a ghost. Benjamin Franklin erased him. The man who discovered electricity and preached the virtue of moderation possessed a heart capable of absolute zero. When the political wind shifted in 1776, Benjamin Franklin didn't just disagree with his son, he destroyed him. He let him rot in a solitary dungeon, ignored his pleas, while his wife died of heartbreak, and finally cut him out of his will with a sentence so petty and vindictive it chills the blood. William Franklin was born in 1730 or 1731, the product of one of Benjamin's many low intrigues with unidentified women. He was illegitimate. In the 18th century, this was a stain that could ruin a life. But Franklin, ever the pragmatist, simply took the baby in. He brought William home to his common-law wife Deborah and forced her to raise the child of his infidelity. This was the first act of dominance. Franklin showed that he made the rules. He loved William, but he treated him as a project. He educated him, dressed him in fine clothes, and molded him into a gentleman. Everything Franklin himself was not by birth. William was handsome, witty, and charming. He was the improved edition of Benjamin. They were inseparable. When Franklin went to the frontier to build forts, William was his aide-de-camp. When Franklin went to London to charm the British elite, William was his wingman. And on that stormy day in Philadelphia in 1752, it was William who stood in the rain, helping his father prove that lightning was electricity. They were partners in Prometheus. The tragedy lies in the fact that Benjamin Franklin saw William not as a separate individual, but as an extension of his own ego. And you do not disagree with your own ego. The rift began with a promotion that looked like a blessing, but turned out to be a curse. In 1763, with Benjamin's help and influence in London, William was appointed the royal governor of New Jersey. This was the pinnacle of the Franklin ambition. The illegitimate son of a printer was now the representative of the King of England. He had status, he had power. He swore a sacred oath of loyalty to King George III. Benjamin was bursting with pride. He addressed William as Your Excellency. But here is the fatal weakness of Benjamin Franklin. He assumed that William's loyalty to the king was just a job, a role to be played. He didn't realize that for William, a man who had spent his whole life craving legitimacy, the title was real. The oath was real. Benjamin was a man of fluid principles. He could be a Briton today and an American tomorrow if the logic held. William was a man of fixed principles. He was a royal governor, and he intended to do his duty. Benjamin had raised a son to be a gentleman, and gentlemen do not break their oaths. He had built a trap that would snap shut the moment the revolution began. The turning point came in January 1774. Benjamin Franklin, serving as a diplomat in London, was summoned to the Privy Council chamber, known as the Cockpit. In a room filled with jeering British lords, he was publicly humiliated by the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, for leaking private letters. For an hour, Franklin stood silent and stone-faced while the British elite mocked him. He walked into that room a proud Briton. He walked out a furious American. The humiliation shattered his love for England. He decided then and there that independence was the only way. He expected William to feel the same. He expected William to resign his governorship in solidarity. They insulted your father, the logic went. You must hate them too. But William didn't resign. He argued that the king had been good to him. He argued that revolution was chaos. He tried to reason with his father. Benjamin took this personally. To a narcissist, independence is a personal right, but disobedience from a subordinate is an insult. He viewed William's refusal not as political conviction, but as a lack of filial piety. The first American began to view his own son as an enemy of the state. The final confrontation happened in May 1775. Benjamin had returned to Philadelphia, now a hero of the patriot cause. William rode down from New Jersey to meet him at a friend's estate called Trevose. It was a scene worthy of Shakespeare. The father, old and famous, sitting by the fire, arguing for revolution. The son, young and stubborn, arguing for reconciliation. They drank wine. They shouted. William famously said that he would remain neutral if he could, but if forced to choose, he would honor his oath to the king. Benjamin looked at him with cold eyes. He realized he could not control his creation. He turned his back on William. He never visited him again. From that moment on, Benjamin Franklin became the deadliest enemy of the royal governor of New Jersey. He used his influence in the Continental Congress to isolate William. When the war started, he didn't lift a finger to save him. In 1776, the Patriots arrested Governor William Franklin. He was declared a traitor to the liberties of America. At first, he was held under house arrest, but as the war intensified, he was moved to Litchfield Jail in Connecticut. This was not a gentleman's prison. It was a hellhole. William was thrown into solitary confinement. The cell was freezing in winter and stifling in summer. He was denied proper food. He slept on a floor covered in straw and filth. His teeth began to rot. His hair fell out. He lost 50 pounds. He was the son of the most famous man in the world. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris dining with kings, negotiating treaties, and being celebrated as the apostle of liberty. He knew where William was. He knew the conditions. He did nothing. William wrote letters begging for help. Benjamin ignored them. When George Washington sent word that William was suffering, Franklin replied with icy detachment, suggesting that William was getting what he deserved for his obstinacy. The vivid visual here is heartbreaking. The father sipping champagne in a Paris salon, while the son shivers in a Connecticut dungeon, rotting alive because he refused to break an oath his father helped him take. The tragedy deepened. William's wife Elizabeth was living as a refugee in British-occupied New York. She was dying of a broken heart and chronic illness. She begged the Continental Congress to let William visit her one last time before she died. Washington was sympathetic, but he deferred to the political leadership, which was dominated by Franklin's influence. The request was denied. Elizabeth died, calling for William. William learned of her death while sitting in his cell. He was not allowed to attend the funeral. This broke him. When he was finally released in a prisoner exchange in 1778, William was no longer just a loyalist. He was a man consumed by vengeance. He became the leader of the Board of Associated Loyalists, a paramilitary group that terrorized patriots. He authorized brutal raids, hangings, and assassinations. The monster that William became was created in the cell where his father left him. Benjamin's coldness birthed a terrorist. The war ended in 1783. America won. Benjamin won. William lost everything. He was exiled to London, a refugee in the land his father hated. In 1785, Benjamin Franklin stopped in Southampton, England, on his way back to America. He agreed to see William. It was brief and cold. There were no tears. There was no forgiveness. Benjamin demanded that William sign over some land deeds in New Jersey to pay debts he owed his father. William, broken and impoverished, signed. Benjamin looked at his son, now a middle-aged, balding man with bad teeth and a ruined life, and saw only a bad investment. He didn't see the boy with the kite. He saw a reminder of his own failure to control the narrative. They parted ways. They never spoke or wrote to each other again. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790. His funeral in Philadelphia was attended by 20,000 people. He was eulogized as the benevolent father of his country, but his last will and testament contained a final calculated act of cruelty. He left substantial bequests to his daughter, Sarah, and his grandchildren. To William, he left almost nothing. He included a sentence that was meant to be read by history. The party acted against me in the late war, which is a public notoriety, will account for my leaving him no more of an estate he endeavored to deprive me of. Even from the grave, Franklin had to have the last word. He had to frame William's loyalty to the crown as a personal theft of Benjamin's estate. It was petty. It was narcissistic. It was the act of a man who could not tolerate a separate existence. The story of the disposable son forces us to confront the dark side of Franklin's utilitarian philosophy. Utilitarianism says, the greatest good for the greatest number. In this equation, William was a negative integer. He stood in the way of the greatest good. Therefore, he had to be subtracted. Franklin applied the same logic to his family that he applied to lightning rods or street lamps. If it works, keep it. If it doesn't work, discard it. William stopped working for Benjamin's ambitions, so he was discarded. This terrified philosophy suggests that to be a great man of history, one must sometimes be a terrible human being. Franklin saved the nation, but he sacrificed his son on the altar of his own legacy. He loved humanity, but he didn't have enough love left over for his own blood. The thread was the thread connecting the lightning bolt to the key. It was the thread connecting father to son. But when the storm of the revolution struck, Benjamin severed that thread. He watched his son drift into the darkness of prison and exile, and he did not bat an eye. William died in London in 1813, an anonymous exile, buried in an unmarked grave. Benjamin lies in Philadelphia beneath a marble headstone, visited by millions. But in the silence of history, the detective hears the lament of the man in Litchfield prison, the son who realizes that his father's virtue was merely a mask concealing a heart of stone. When Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris in 1776, he didn't arrive as a conquering hero. He arrived as a desperate beggar. He put on a rough fur cap. He played the role of the Quaker philosopher to perfection. But behind the fur cap and the kindly smile was the mind of a shark. In the salons of Paris, Franklin was not a simple rustic. He was a master manipulator. He seduced powerful women to gain access to their husbands. He planted fake news in the press. He lived in a nest of spies, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with British intelligence. To the detective of history, Franklin's wardrobe was a weapon. In Paris, he dressed like a frontiersman. The French elite were obsessed with the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of the natural man. They wanted to believe that America was a utopia of simple virtue. Franklin leaned into this fantasy. He wore his fur cap indoors, even at dinner parties. He refused to wear a sword. He spoke French with a deliberate, charming struggle. The French went wild. Women wore Franklin hairstyles. His face appeared on snuff boxes, rings, and vases. He was the first modern celebrity. This was all cold calculation. He used their obsession with him to hide the fact that he was there to drag them into a global war. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, or rather, a diplomat in a beaver hat. Franklin was 70 years old when he arrived in Paris. He was fat, suffered from gout and kidney stones, and had painful skin rashes. Yet, he became the greatest seducer in Paris. He focused his attention on the wealthy, intellectual women who ran the salons, the social gatherings where politics were decided. Two women in particular became his targets, Madame Briand and Madame Helvetius. Madame Briand was a married musician in her 30s. Franklin, old enough to be her grandfather, pursued her with a relentless, playful lechery. He wrote her letters begging for charity. He sat on her lap in public. They played chess while she soaked in her bathtub. Madame Helvetius was a wealthy widow with a salon full of philosophers. Franklin proposed marriage to her. Was this love, or was it espionage? The detective notes that these women were connected to the most powerful men in France. By charming them, Franklin gained backdoor access to ministers and bankers. He used sex as a diplomatic tool. He realized that in France, the way to the king's wallet was through the hearts of the court's women. He weaponized his own libido for the sake of the revolution. The darkest secret of Franklin's Paris years lived under his own roof. Franklin's embassy in Passy was a sieve. Every letter he wrote, every plan he made was sent directly to London within 48 hours. The traitor was Edward Bancroft, Franklin's personal secretary and close friend. Bancroft was a double agent. He was on the payroll of the British Secret Service. He used invisible ink to send intelligence to London. He placed dead drops in hollow trees in the Tuileries garden. Because of Bancroft, King George III knew about the Treaty of Alliance with France before the American Congress did. Did Franklin know? This is one of the great historical mysteries. Arthur Lee, Franklin's fellow diplomat, constantly warned him that the embassy was compromised. He pointed the finger at Bancroft. Franklin dismissed the warnings. He famously said, "I have no doubt that there are spies about us. But if we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear." Franklin may have known Bancroft was a spy and used him. By feeding Bancroft specific information, Franklin could manipulate what the British knew. It's the double-cross theory. Franklin was so confident in his intellect that he believed he could outsmart a spy sitting at his own breakfast table. Or perhaps it was just the arrogance of the fatal weakness. He liked Bancroft, and he disliked Arthur Lee, so he chose to trust the traitor and ignore the patriot. Speaking of Arthur Lee, his fate reveals the ruthless side of Franklin's diplomacy. Arthur Lee was an honest, paranoid, and rigid American patriot sent to help Franklin in Paris. Lee was horrified by Franklin's lifestyle. He saw the luxury, the women, the lack of security, and the corruption. He accused Franklin of surrounding himself with spies and war profiteers. Franklin didn't argue with Lee. He didn't defend himself. He simply destroyed Lee. Franklin used his influence with the French court to freeze Lee out. He wrote letters to Congress painting Lee as crazy, jealous, and incompetent. He mobilized his network of friends to slander Lee's reputation. Congress believed the famous Dr. Franklin over the sour Arthur Lee. Lee was recalled in disgrace, his career ruined. The tragedy is that Lee was right about almost everything. The embassy was full of spies. Money was being embezzled. But in the world of power, being right doesn't matter if you aren't liked. Franklin crushed an honest man to protect his own comfortable, corrupt ecosystem. Franklin didn't just manipulate people, he manipulated reality. He set up a printing press in his basement in Passy, but he didn't just print pamphlets, he printed forgeries. In a stroke of dark genius, he created a fake issue of a Boston newspaper. In it, he wrote a gruesome story claiming that the British were paying Native American tribes for the scalps of American colonists. He fabricated a bag of scalps manifesto, detailing innocent women and children butchered by British savages. He sent this fake newspaper to his friends in Europe. It was reprinted across the continent. Public opinion turned violently against Britain. This was black propaganda. It was a lie. While scalping did happen on the frontier, Franklin invented the specific industrial-scale scalp market to horrify the French. He was willing to incite racial hatred and fabricate war crimes to win the sympathy war. To Franklin, the truth was just another raw material to be shaped, bent, or broken for the cause. The climax of Franklin's Paris mission was the Treaty of Alliance. He convinced King Louis XVI, an absolute monarch, to fund a republican revolution against another monarch. It was a diplomatic miracle, but the detective sees the cost. Franklin knew that France was broke. He knew that entering this war would bankrupt the French state. He pushed them anyway. He encouraged the French to take out massive loans. He milked the French treasury dry. The debt France incurred fighting for American independence was a direct cause of the French Revolution a decade later. The poverty and hunger that led to the guillotine began, in part, with the checks Franklin cashed. Did Franklin care? Probably not. His utilitarian calculus was focused on America. If the French monarchy had to collapse to birth the American Republic, that was a price he was willing to let them pay. He played Louis XVI like a fiddle, leading him slowly to his own execution. By 1785, the war was over. America was free. Franklin's job was done. He packed up his furs, his printing press, and his secrets. He left behind a string of broken hearts and a bankrupt country. When he boarded the ship back to Philadelphia, he was old and in pain. The stones in his bladder were agony. The gout crippled him, but he was triumphant. He had proven that a printer's son could outwit the kings of Europe. He had used deceit and cynicism to achieve liberty. But as the ship cut through the Atlantic, he carried one final secret. He knew that the Franklin the world loved was a fiction. The Quaker philosopher was a character he had written, acted, and directed. The real man was still the one who sat in the Hellfire Club, who dissected bodies in the basement, and who let his son rot in prison. The mask was coming off, and he was returning home to die. In the summer of 1787, the streets of Philadelphia witnessed a strange daily ritual. 4 prisoners from the local jail would carry a large, ornate sedan chair through the heat to the Pennsylvania State House. Inside the box sat an 81-year-old man, so racked with pain that he could not walk, and so stoned on opium that he sometimes drifted into a trance. This was Benjamin Franklin, heading to the Constitutional Convention. We remember him in this moment as the sage, the wise grandfather who united the squabbling delegates to create the United States Constitution. But the detective sees a different figure. We see a man whose body was rotting from the inside out, battling a bladder stone the size of a hen's egg. We see a man grappling with his original sin, the fact that, for 30 years, the champion of liberty had owned human beings as property. And we see a man crafting his final and greatest deception, rewriting his own life story to ensure he would be remembered as a saint, not a sinner. The Franklin who returned from France was a physical wreck. The medical horror of his final years is often edited out of the history books. He suffered from a massive bladder stone that made urination a torture session. The vibration of a carriage on cobblestones caused him agony, which is why he imported the sedan chair from France. He literally had to be carried by other men. To manage the pain, Franklin became a heavy user of laudanum. The sage who sat in Independence Hall was frequently operating through an opium haze. This adds a psychedelic layer to the founding of the nation. The calm, benevolent demeanor that historians praise may have been less about wisdom and more about the sedative effects of the drug. He was the electric Frankenstein. Now he was the opium sage. At the Constitutional Convention, Franklin was too weak to stand and give speeches. Instead, he wrote them down and had his colleague, James Wilson, read them aloud. This turned out to be a brilliant tactical move. It made his words seem like disembodied wisdom, detached from the heat of the argument. He played the role of the great compromiser. When the big states and small states were ready to kill each other over representation, it was Franklin who suggested the compromise. But notice the utilitarian coldness again. Franklin didn't actually believe in the compromise. He hated the idea of a Senate. He hated the idea of a powerful president. But he knew that to get the deal done, he had to sacrifice his principles. He viewed the Constitution not as a holy text, but as a machine. If the machine ran, it was good. He famously looked at the sun carved into George Washington's chair and said, "I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." He sold the Constitution to the public with the same skill he used to sell the war to the French. He was the ultimate closer. Now we must confront the darkest stain on the first American. For the majority of his life, Benjamin Franklin was a slave owner. From roughly 1735 to 1781, he owned enslaved people, Peter, Jemima, Othello, King, and George. He didn't just own them. He profited from the system. His newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, ran hundreds of advertisements for the sale of slaves and the capture of runaways. He made money every time a neighbor sold a human being. In his early writings, he expressed views that were deeply racist. He worried that the influx of swarthy Germans and Africans would darken the complexion of America. He wanted America to be lovely white. The detective asks, how does the man who wrote "All men are created equal" reconcile this? He didn't. For decades, he simply ignored the contradiction. He took his slave Peter to London. When Peter ran away, Franklin didn't celebrate Peter's liberty. He complained about the inconvenience of losing a servant. It was only in the very last years of his life, when he was over 80, that Franklin pivoted. He became the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He wrote fiery essays attacking slavery. He petitioned Congress to end the slave trade immediately. Why the change? The generous view. He evolved. He realized the hypocrisy. He wanted to fix his mistake before he died. The cynical view. He was building his legacy. He knew that history would judge slavery harshly. He wanted to be on the right side of history. Just like he scrubbed the Hellfire Club from his past, he tried to scrub his slave-owning past by becoming the loudest abolitionist in the room at the very last minute. His final public act was a biting satire where he compared American arguments for slavery to the arguments of an Algerian pirate enslaving Christians. It was brilliant, funny, and devastating. But to the thousands of people who were sold through the ads in his newspaper for 40 years, this late conversion did little good. As death approached in 1790, Franklin turned his attention to his will, but the will reveals other secrets. He left his diamond-encrusted picture of King Louis XVI to his daughter, Sarah. He left his crabtree walking stick to George Washington. But the most interesting part is what he didn't leave. He left no money to the church. He left no confession of faith. He wrote a new epitaph for himself. As a young man, he had written a flowery epitaph comparing his body to an old book. But in reality, he was buried under a simple stone that just said Benjamin and Deborah Franklin, 1790. Even in death, he linked himself to the wife he had ignored for a decade. It was a final act of appearance, looking like the devoted husband he never was. In April 1790, the end came. The bladder stone had done its work. An abscess in his lung burst. His daughter Sarah sat by his side. According to the legend, his last words were a quip. When told to change position so he could breathe easier, he whispered, "A dying man can do nothing easy." Even at death's door, he was crafting sound bites. He died on April 17th, 1790. But there is a ghost in the room. William was not there. The son was in London, exiled. Did Franklin think of him? Did he regret the coldness? There is no evidence of it. Franklin died as he lived, looking forward, not backward. He was utilitarian to the last breath. The relationship with William had no utility, so it was discarded. As we stand over Franklin's grave, we have to ask, who was he? He was the man in the fur cap. He was the man in the Hellfire monk's robe. He was the man in the apron. He was the man in the sedan chair. He was a chameleon. He adapted to his environment perfectly. In Puritan Boston, he was a rebel. In Quaker Philadelphia, he was a businessman. In aristocratic London, he was a hedonist. In royalist Paris, he was a celebrity. In Republican America, he was a sage. This adaptability is what made him the first American. He invented the American archetype, the self-made man who can reinvent himself at will. But the cost of being a chameleon is that you have no true color. The bone cellar and the dungeon prove that beneath the masks there was a frightening emptiness, a lack of deep, unshakable connection to other human beings. It is February 1998. The friends of Benjamin Franklin House are popping champagne. They have finally raised the money to restore the derelict Georgian townhouse at 36 Craven Street, London. They plan to turn it into a shiny museum celebrating the wisdom and diplomacy of the first American. But the celebration stops the moment the shovel hits the dirt in the basement. A construction worker finds a thigh bone, then a skull, then a jawbone with teeth still attached. Work halts. The police are called. The site is taped off. Is this a serial killer's dumping ground? Is it a blitz victim? When the forensic archaeologists brush away the dirt, they don't find a few bones. They find a pit of horrors. Over 1,200 human skeletal remains are cataloged. The museum curators are horrified. They wanted to tell a story about kites and treaties. Instead, they are staring at a forensic puzzle that threatens to turn Benjamin Franklin from a founding father into a founding monster. The basement of 36 Craven Street is a windowless, damp chamber. For 2 centuries, it sat undisturbed beneath the floorboards of the parlor where Franklin entertained guests. The detective notes the location of the pit. It wasn't hidden in a corner. It was central. It was a disposal site used repeatedly. When the team from the Institute of Archaeology at University College London arrived, they realized the bones were old. Carbon dating placed them squarely in the mid-18th century, exactly when Franklin was the tenant. The police breathed a sigh of relief. This wasn't a modern crime. But for historians, the crime was just beginning. The bones were not intact skeletons. They were fragments. A femur here, a rib there, a vertebrae there. It was a jigsaw puzzle of human debris. This suggests that the bodies were not buried with respect. They were discarded like kitchen scraps. The visual is stark. The man who wrote The Way to Wealth was living on top of a pile of human waste. Forensic analysis by Dr. Simon Davis revealed the demographics of the pit. The count, at least 15 separate individuals. The age, the most chilling discovery. 6 of the victims were children. 1 was an infant, barely a few months old. Who were they? There are no dental records from the 1770s, no DNA databases, but the tragedy allows us to infer their identities. They were likely the invisible people of London, orphans from the workhouses, paupers who died in the gutters of Covent Garden. The resurrection men didn't dig up rich people. Rich people had iron coffins and guards. They dug up the poor. Franklin, the champion of the common man, was literally building his scientific knowledge on the dismantled bodies of the commonest people imaginable. The irony is suffocating. The child in the pit might have been a street urchin Franklin passed on his way to the printer's shop, only to meet him again on the dissection table. The bones tell a story of methodical violence. Under the microscope, the bones showed distinct linear cuts. These were not the hack marks of a murderer trying to hide a body. They were the precise rhythmic cuts of a surgical saw. Many of the skulls had been trepanned. Trepanning is the act of drilling a hole into the skull. In the 18th century, this was a treatment for everything from migraines to insanity. But on a cadaver, it's practice. The forensic team found skulls with multiple holes, drilled at different angles. This was a classroom. Someone was teaching a student how to drill into a human brain without killing the patient? Who was the teacher? William Hewson. Who was the student? Perhaps Franklin himself. We know Franklin was fascinated by the brain. He wrote about the circulation of blood. Is it possible that the old diplomat, his eyes failing, leaned in to turn the crank of the trephine, feeling the skull give way, driven by a morbid curiosity to see what lay beneath the bone? The investigation revealed more than just human bones. Mercury. Traces of mercury were found in the soil. Mercury was the standard treatment for syphilis in the 18th century. It suggests that some of the bodies dissected were patients who had died of venereal disease, or that Franklin and Hewson were injecting mercury into the cadavers to trace the lymphatic system. Animals. The pit contained the bones of sea turtles, pigeons, and rabbits. The sea turtles are the smoking gun linking Franklin. We know from his letters that Franklin received gifts of whole sea turtles from America. He loved turtle soup. The forensic evidence shows that the turtles were butchered for food, and then their skeletons were dissected for science. It paints a picture of the household economy. A turtle arrives. Margaret Stevenson makes soup for dinner. Franklin and Hewson eat the soup. Then they take the bones downstairs to compare the turtle's spine to the human spine found in the grave of a pauper. It is a closed loop of consumption and curiosity. Why wasn't Franklin charged with a crime? The defense argues that anatomy was a necessary evil. Without dissection, there is no surgery. Without surgery, people die of appendicitis and broken legs. Franklin's supporters argue that he was merely the landlord. He allowed Hewson to work there, but he didn't wield the knife. But the detective rejects this. The house is small. The smell of 15 rotting bodies cannot be ignored. The garden is tiny. The deliveries happened at night. Franklin wrote letters praising Hewson's work. He was a man who noticed everything, from the temperature of the Gulf Stream to the conductivity of lightning. To claim he didn't know about the body farm in his own basement is absurd. He provided the cover. He was the dawn of the operation. Hewson was the hit man. This discovery forces us to revisit Franklin's psychology. How does a man write about doing good to his fellow creatures while sitting above a mass grave? Compartmentalization. Franklin had a drawer in his mind for politics. He had a drawer for science. When he opened the science drawer, the rules of the politics drawer didn't apply. In the science drawer, a dead child is not a tragedy. It is a specimen. A skull is not a person. It is a puzzle box. This ability to shut off empathy is what makes a great scientist, but it also makes a terrifying human being. It explains how he could be so cold to his son William. Once William stopped being useful or rational, Franklin moved him from the family drawer to the trash drawer. The investigation concludes that the bones at 36 Craven Street are not the work of a serial killer like Jack the Ripper. They are the work of the Enlightenment. They represent the ugly, dirty, bloody underside of progress. Franklin wanted to improve the world. He wanted to cure diseases. He wanted to understand the human machine. But the price of that understanding was the desecration of the poor. The cold case verdict is guilty of accessory to grave robbing and desecration of a corpse, but no judge will bang the gavel. Franklin is too big to jail. Today, 36 Craven Street is a museum. You can visit it. You can walk into the seminar room where the bones were found. There is a glass window in the floor looking down into the darkness. When you look through that glass, you aren't just seeing dirt. You are seeing the literal foundation of the modern world, science built on the backs of the nameless dead. As we leave the basement and climb back up to the light of the street, one question remains. If Franklin were alive today, would he apologize? Probably not. He would look at us over his spectacles and say, "The living are improved by the study of the dead. I made use of what others wasted. Is that not the definition of thrift?" It is a chilling logic, and it is entirely American. Take a $100 bill out of your wallet. Look at the face. It is the most valuable piece of paper in the world, and on it sits the face of Benjamin Franklin. He looks calm, grandfatherly, and faintly amused. It is the face of American stability. But over the course of this series, we have peeled back the layers of that face. We have gone into the damp basement at 36 Craven Street and touched the sawed bones of children. We have descended into the caves of the Hellfire Club and smelled the stale wine of an orgy. We have stood in the dungeon of a Connecticut prison and listened to his own son begging for mercy that never came. We have found that the first American was actually two men. There was the Daylight Franklin, the scientist, the diplomat, the patriot who preached virtue. And there was the Midnight Franklin, the grave robber's patron, the hedonist, the cold-hearted father who discarded his own blood. We must answer the ultimate question. Was his greatness worth the moral cost? Is it possible to be a father of a country without being a monster to your own family? Or is the Midnight Franklin the true price of the Enlightenment? To understand Franklin is to understand the American character. He didn't just help found the country, he invented its personality. He taught us that appearance is as important as reality. Remember his advice. It is not enough to be virtuous, one must also appear so. This is the key to the basement. Franklin believed that as long as the public saw the kite and the library, the private reality of the bone pit didn't matter. He created the modern concept of the public image. The detective realizes that Franklin was the first spin doctor. He spun his own life story in his autobiography, carefully omitting the Hellfire Club, the illegitimate children, and the cruelty to William. He presented a sanitized version of himself, a Disney-fied Franklin, that Americans have swallowed for 200 years. When we discovered the bones in 1998, we weren't just finding skeletons, we were finding the truth that he tried to hide. We were seeing the gap between the marketing and the product. Throughout this series, we have returned to the philosophy of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Franklin is the patron saint of this idea. He looked at a lightning bolt and asked, "How can I make this useful?" He looked at a human body and asked, "How can I make this useful?" This made him a brilliant scientist. It allowed him to cure diseases and build fire stations. But when you apply utilitarianism to people, it becomes monstrous. William Franklin stopped being useful to the cause of liberty, so he was discarded. The pauper children in London were dead. They were no longer useful as citizens. So they were used as raw material for anatomy. The tragedy of Franklin is that he viewed human beings as components in a machine. If the component was broken or obsolete, he replaced it. He lacked sentimentality. We like to think of our grandfathers as sentimental, warm figures. Franklin was not. He was a calculator. He calculated that the pain of his son was a necessary expense for the independence of the nation. The math worked, but the morality failed. Let us revisit the 1,200 bones one last time. They are the collateral damage of Franklin's curiosity. In the 18th century, men like Franklin believed they were bringing light to a dark world. They called it the Enlightenment. They believed that science and reason would save humanity. But the bones remind us that the Enlightenment had a dark underbelly. To learn how the blood flows, someone had to bleed. To learn how the brain works, someone had to be drilled. Franklin represents the arrogance of the intellect. He believed he was above the superstitious laws of the church and the state. He believed that because he was a philosopher, he had the right to desecrate a grave if it meant learning something new. This is the mad scientist archetype. We see it in fiction with Dr. Frankenstein. We see it in history with Benjamin Franklin. The kite string connects the heavens to the earth, but the shovel connects the scholar to the dirt. The most damning witness against Benjamin Franklin is not a skeleton. It is his son. The destruction of William Franklin is the emotional core of this tragedy. Benjamin wrote eloquently about tyranny. He called King George III a tyrant for taxing tea. But in his private life, Benjamin was a tyrant of the absolute worst kind. He demanded total obedience from his son. When William exercised his own conscience, his own right to choose his political loyalty, Benjamin destroyed him. He practiced a form of emotional tyranny that left William broken, impoverished, and exiled. How can a man love liberty but hate his son's freedom of choice? It is the paradox of the narcissist. Franklin saw William not as a free man, but as an extension of himself. William's rebellion wasn't just political. It was a personal insult to Benjamin's ego. History has sided with Benjamin because America won. We view William as the traitor. But if you look at it through the lens of family, Benjamin is the villain. He sacrificed his child on the altar of his ambition. And what of the caves? The Hellfire Club reveals that the founding fathers were not stained glass saints. They were men with appetites. Franklin's time in the caves teaches us about the corruption of power. He sat with the men who ruled the British Empire while they drank and whored. He saw that the great men of history are often the most depraved. This cynicism fueled the American Revolution. Franklin didn't fear the British lords because he had seen them naked and drunk. He knew they were not gods, but it also corrupted him. It taught him that morality is for the little people. The elite, the scientists, the diplomats, the philosophers, can do what they want in the dark as long as they wear a nice suit in the daylight. We see this legacy in modern politics every day. The scandals, the cover-ups, the double lives of our leaders. Franklin wrote the playbook for all of it. Why do we love him? Despite the bones, despite the cruelty, despite the orgies. Why is he still the most beloved founder? Because he is us. Washington is too stiff like a statue. Jefferson is too aloof, an aristocrat in a castle. But Franklin is the guy you want to have a beer with. He is funny. He is clever. He is struggling with his weight. He is trying to get rich. He is trying to get laid. He represents the American dream, the idea that you can start as a poor printer with 2 pennies in your pocket and end up as the most famous man in the world. We forgive his sins because they are the sins of ambition. We forgive the bones in the basement because we like the electricity in the wall. We forgive the treatment of William because we like the Constitution. We have made a deal with Franklin just as he made a deal with history. We accept the light and ignore the darkness. So what is the verdict of the detective? Benjamin Franklin was a genius. He was a visionary. He was a patriot. He was also a hypocrite. He was a narcissist. He was an accessory to crimes against the dead. He was a great man, but he was not a good man. Greatness requires a certain ruthlessness. It requires the ability to shut off your heart and use your head. It requires the ability to walk over bones, to reach the sky. Franklin possessed this ruthlessness in abundance. The discovery at 36 Craven Street did not destroy his legacy. It completed it. It showed us the full cost of his genius. It reminds us that the kite and the key are not the whole story. The story includes the shovel and the saw. Imagine Benjamin Franklin today. He is standing in the museum at 36 Craven Street. He is looking down through the glass floor at the pit where the bones used to be. He doesn't look guilty. He doesn't look sad. He adjusts his spectacles. He taps his cane. He looks at us with that faint, ironic smile on his face. I gave you a country, he seems to say. I gave you the lightning. I gave you the library. Are you really going to complain about a few skeletons in the closet? And then he turns and walks out the door into the bustling streets of London, disappearing into the history he wrote for himself. And that is the dark, complex, and electrified story of Benjamin Franklin. We have traveled from the height of the storm to the depth of the grave. We have seen the price of the American dream. The next time you look at a $100 bill, look closely at the eyes. Ask yourself, what is he hiding? And are we, as a nation, any different? The bones are gone, but the ghost remains. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like and subscribe. We have many more secrets to uncover. The past is never dead. It's just buried in the basement. Good night.